Hi, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore, and I'm thrilled today to welcome Alexandra Kleeman for a discussion of her new novel, Something New Under the Sun, in conversation with Adam Dalva. While we're eagerly awaiting the return of in-person events, virtual ones like these continue to be a source of joy for all of us. So I do want to give a very special thanks to our guests for joining us this evening and to all of you at home for tuning in. To some housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters. They cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We'll be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat button through which I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, which is of course very important. One caveat for tonight's event is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so do bear with any technical issues that might arise, and we'll try to resolve them quickly. And we've also scheduled a whole host of summer and fall programming for you, so do head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is on Tuesday, August 31st. We're thrilled to welcome Eula Biss for the paperback launch of her book, Having and Being Had, in conversation with Lauren LeBlanc. That program is up on our website now, taking registrations. And finally, we've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe setting. So if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. Now, a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Alexandra Kleeman is the author of Intimations, a short story collection, and the novel You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine, which was a New York Times editor's choice. Her fiction has been published in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Zoetrope, Conjunctions, and Guernica, among other publications. And her other writing has appeared in Harper's, The New York Times Magazine, Vogue, Tin House, N+1, and The Guardian. Her work has received fellowships and support from Breadloaf, the Jurassic Resident Program, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Headland Center for the Arts. She's the winner of the Berlin Prize and the Bard Fiction Prize, and was a Rome Prize Literature Fellow at the American Academy in Rome. She lives in Staten Island and teaches at the New School, which is joining us this evening from Portland. Adam Dalva's writing has appeared in the New York Review of Books, the Paris Review, and The Guardian. His graphic novel, Olivia Twist, was published by Dark Horse in 2019. Adam serves on the board of the National Book Critics Circle and is a book critic for Guernica magazine. He teaches creative writing at Rutgers University and is a graduate of NYU's Fiction MFA program, where he was a Veterans Writing Workshop Fellow. So now, without any further ado, Alex and Adam, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Noah. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Adam. I'm so happy to talk to you on this side of publication.
I am so happy.
You may not know, but Adam was the first person I talked to about this book back in February or so. And we said we'd like to do it again, and I'm really glad we get to.
I am so happy to talk to you about it again. And I was going over our transcript, and what a great conversation, but also it was fun seeing you keep going like, I hadn't actually thought about this book in any way other than writing it yet. So I'm hoping to keep some of that kind of raw energy tonight.
Yeah, I'm a little bit past that point, but not too far.
I was worried about that. So we're talking today about this amazing novel, Something New Under the Sun. And just to give a tiny bit of context, this is a book set in a sort of near future alternate world California, and it follows the kind of misadventures of a wonderful protagonist called Patrick as he goes there to deal with his film adaptation and meets the kind of star of the book, a former child star, Cassidy, who's starring in the film. And Alex, we thought you might start with a reading, if that was okay.
Yeah, and that's a great introduction too, because most of the times when I've read from this book, I've read something that has to do with Patrick's perspective. And really, as the book goes along, it becomes more and more Cassidy's story for reasons that will become clear. And I was especially excited to read this part that comes toward the end of the book, because Adam and I talked about it way back when in the winter, which is a little bit outside the main plot of the book, but which I think tells you a lot about Cassidy. So all you need to know about this section is that Cassidy, our child star whose career has seen a little bit of a decline recently, is thinking back to a time when she took a job in Greece that wasn't such a great idea, where she kind of ended up semi-kidnapped. Okay. So this is her in Greece. As far as Cassidy could see, the island was brown, dry, and studded with gnarled black trees. She had traveled 36 hours straight. A dense body shirt collected her from the small dock in a scuffed-up truck with a Mercedes hood ornament. As they crawled up the narrow, dusty roads toward the top of the island, Cassidy saw a block of hulking white squatting on a rock outcrop. It looked like a clod of snow. She rolled down the window to smell the sea breeze, and Nikos immediately rolled it back up. Women shouldn't breathe hot air, he explained. The white block on the hillside was where she'd be filming and sleeping. Past a shiny gate, the driveway led to a brick courtyard with a single shriveled tree crouched in the center. 4 bikinis were laid out on the bed in her room, each in a sparkly metallic pattern. When she came back down in a cute tunic she had brought, a small group of men sitting and smoking on the terrace called Nikos over to confer. Irritated, Nikos walked over to Cassidy and asked if the swimsuits didn't fit her or what. She said, "I'd rather wear my own clothes." And he nodded and said, "For today, okay, but tomorrow the costumes." The pool was scattered with girls in skimpy tops and fountain bottoms who weren't drunk yet and didn't seem to know one another. They stared forward, some on their phones, others silently looking at nothing specific. Elsewhere, a button was pressed and techno gushed from the speakers. When she asked how many days the shoot would last, Nico said 5 days, and then he said 6. The first couple days, Cassidy lay beneath anonymous hands, rubbing her body with globs of sunscreen, turning and smiling for the camera whenever they said. She took shots of cloudy liquor and fell backward into the pool, shrieking with laughter. Then they'd pull her out, blow dry her hair crispy, and do it again and again. Slathered in glitter, she took shots from the flat bellies of bored girls, unprofessionals who didn't know whether they should smile or act sexy. She poured the milky ooze over their oiled bodies straight from the plastic bottle and waited for them to get hosed off and did it again with a big toothy grin on her face until Nico said they had gotten the shot. She got trashed in the vertical noontime sun and passed out under a blue and white striped umbrella. Then the men dumped ice on her to wake her up and make her party again. She looked like a nobody, she realized, as they played the footage back for her. But a few days in, Nikos came with instructions from the men. She was to hold the container of sunscreen up in front of her, smile big, and say with a loud and happy voice, "Party with Eidos." Cassidy explained to him that product endorsements were a whole other thing. They needed thick contracts and big fees. Because being the face of one cosmetic product meant, for example, that she wouldn't be approached by other brands. It was a future loss of income, so she needed to be compensated accordingly. Now it became clear that the watchful silence of the 4 men was about power, not language. They came over a few at a time to ask Nikos what was wrong, then turned to Cassidy, saying with childlike firmness, "You want the money, you say the line. We don't pay unless you do the job." Then they shoved the product at her and she gave it back, and they put it in her hand and she lifted it high above her head and threw it, then overturned a table littered with glasses and liquor bottles. An area by the pool was covered with thick shards of glass, and she could hear the women fleeing into the house, their murmuring unintelligible but for its tone of fear. Someone held her by the arms and tried to drag her inside. She gave him an off-center headbutt that bloodied her brow. Then there were men grabbing at her, holding her arms and shoulders and waist, a hand on her face pushing it down and up again. Soon Cassidy was in her room with the door locked from the outside. When she threatened to call her agent, the police, the Secretary of State, they told her to go ahead and call, only her phone got no service. Around 10 at night, the sky finally grew dark and someone unlocked the door for long enough to shove a plate of chicken and potatoes across the threshold. She ate the cubes of chicken and brothy potatoes with her bare hands, wiping them on a towel and looking out the window at the flat blue line of the sea, which moved ceaselessly and imperceptibly in the distance. Nikos woke her up in the morning, sheepish and muttering apologies, and handed over a tray of fried eggs, toast, and oil-drizzled tomatoes. It was not a big budget project or well-funded project, he explained, and everyone thought the terms had been made clear enough in the invitation sent by email. The producers hoped that she would be willing to come out of the room and do the few product shots that were left as a favor to all of them, at which point they would pay her fee and put her back on the boats. Cassidy Carter listened, nodding and smiling, and when he finished speaking, she calmly asked for her fee to be tripled. Thank you. It doesn't go well.
Yeah, that would be amazing if he was like, oh, okay.
It's a power move. Probably works if you have power.
I'll have to think about that if I ever get it. Well, I love that part, and I'm so glad you read it for us. I love kind of how you go to a sort of contained place with these characters, and she, I guess since we started with her, and we're getting some snaps, I guess since we started with her, I wanted to start by asking about kind of Cassidy and the creation of her before we kind of go into the book in general. And just for the audience, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. And if any questions sort of come up to you while I'm talking with Alex, just put them in the chat and we'll make sure we get in the Q&A section. We'll make sure we get to them by the end of the night. So you and I are about the same age. We came of age in the Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, maybe Lindsay Lohan kind of era of the teen star and then the fallen teen star. Cassidy was on a show called Cassie Keen, Kid Detective, and she was a kid star. So famous that everyone in Hollywood, many girls have the same nose as her after plastic surgery. So I was wondering what about this sort of fallen teen idol kind of drew you to her as a character?
Yeah. I mean, it seems really natural, I think, to talk about the fallen teen idol again, since enough time has elapsed that these fallen teen idols are back. They're making comebacks. Lindsay's going to be in a movie. Britney is finally dissolving or changing her conservatorship. All of these things have happened in the last few months. And I think that it might be something of a generational thing. Like, I know that I grew up as a girl watching these images of Lindsay Lohan, her mugshot, Britney Spears with her head shaved, shaving her head at the barber shop, or coming out to attack paparazzi with a umbrella, and they felt like warnings to me. They felt like they were images that were both meant to draw me in, but also to speak to me specifically and say, you can't refuse a part of the whole deal of employment and image to a package of being a woman in this world. You have to take the whole thing, or you end up like this. You end up with the system sort of pushing you out, or being unable to fit into it in any way. And in part, it's a question of timeline. I think enough time has passed that we're able to look back on both our behaviors from that age, the things that we did and didn't question, and the things that we saw and didn't question, the things that we took as they were framed to us, and think, well, what was really happening there? And I've always felt that in certain positions, like, celebrities are lifted up above the rest of us in a lot of ways and don't deal with a lot of what we deal with, but they do deal with this extremely magnified public gaze, the scrutiny, and the way that also in an interview I just did with an actress about a movie that's coming out, she talked about how, since she is really the main character of this movie, the camera was on her so much that when it turned off, she felt like something had been taken from her. The camera, that gaze, is extractive. And so to put someone in this book who feels that extraction and that sort of exploitative gaze more than your average person, I think, was a way at getting at what happens all through the capitalist image generating, image mining system, but maybe only begins to affect us much later if we're in a normal sort of position and getting a normal level of scrutiny.
Yeah, and I think that question about scrutiny is interesting when it comes to writing a novel and maybe creating this character, because she also is separately, almost from her identity, an incredibly talented actor. I think that's something that came across to me when I was reading the book, and was a move I maybe wasn't expecting. But all of a sudden, there are scenes where her acting comes to life, and so much of the classic California Hollywood novel, which this is in small part, I think is about artifice versus reality. So the reality of hidden talent in a character must be kind of interesting to play with.
Yeah, it's the opposite of my profession, right? To be an actor is to shape yourself to other people's desires, shape your performance in all of these different ways, become other people. And being a writer is to sit still all the time, and try to imagine those lives that you're not living, while getting to be utterly comfortable and sweatpants wearing and things like that. But I've always been fascinated by the sort of plasticity that's expected of people and professions. So in the same way that you're supposed to give emotionally when you're in the service industry, you're supposed to give emotionally and give of your sort of genuine warmth when you're a hostess or a waitress or something like that. I think that it is also true that acting is a field of emotional generosity, generating the emotion that people want from you, and giving it freely, not holding anything back. So I think it's really interesting to think about what a character would be like who's been socialized into this field from the very start. When you are made plastic before you've gotten a chance to think about what your own shape, what your own rigidity might be like, what things are flexible for you and what things are not. I think it can be really difficult to find a form that you are comfortable retaining. So that's Cassidy. When we meet her in the story, she's got this potential to convincingly be what people want her to be. But to do that, she not only has to give something up of herself, but she also has to live in the illusion a little bit. Like she is told to see something in the green screened area where they're filming, and from looking at her you can tell she's seeing something there, and that's very spooky, that's eerie, and it's a skill and a talent, but it's also a hazard, I think, to uproot yourself from consensus reality or from the reality that you know yourself to be invested in.
Consensus reality is kind of a fascinating term for a book that is partially a creation that's in an alternate world. And so is your recurrent use of plastic as you're talking, because part of this book, beyond the Hollywood stuff, is a science fiction sort of parable about a near future California where there's an invented synthetic water. And I'm going to call it watar. Is that right?
Watar, yeah.
Watar. And I wonder, I practiced that several times before the event. I want that to be very clear. I was wondering if you could talk maybe about the desire to create this novel, and maybe zooming out a bit, what inspired this world, what inspired this place and this time frame and these characters?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you look at the history of the human relationship to natural resources, it's a story of discovery, exhaustion, and substitution in a lot of ways. Like we in our nation's colonial history, people arrive in French Canada. People find vast forests that can be exploited. They quickly exploit those forests, and when resources in the near areas are exhausted, they substitute resources in other areas. We see it too with wood that we get from Southeast Asia right now. Like we no longer have to deal as much with the inconvenience of seeing our own forests get cut down around us, but we do that by substituting forests from some other nation, some other people. And I think that logic is very beguiling, especially when it happens out of your sight. Then it seems like a magical act of sort of renewal rather than the continued extraction and exploitation. So I think that I was interested in water as a water substitute that I could really imagine being used if the water crisis became severe enough in the West, and if it was cheap to manufacture water. And if you ever find me on the street or in a coffee shop or something and want to hear all the other things I thought of about the chemical composition of water and how it would work and like what would happen in the factory, I'd be happy to talk your ear off. The main thing is that it's a substitute that is not exactly like the thing that it's replacing. And I think that that is also true of the other substitutions we've made to maintain our lifestyle, that there are hidden costs, there are differences, there are ways in which taking wood from one area causes unexpected effects, introduces parasites or invasive species into the place that we've transported that wood. Things are just more intertwined and more complex than we can imagine. So water is also built with some of these inconvenient properties that make it difficult to substitute exactly into our systems. And as you read the book, you find out that it's connected to a sort of neurological epidemic that's going on, and it's seeping into the landscape and causing maybe a new species of plant with little blue flowers that don't burn and behave more like a plastic or a wax. I love, one of the things I love about science fiction is the way that it just reimagines another material, another substance, another entity that you have to contend with, and it lets it sort of make its course through the fictive world, and lets you trace sort of the effects spreading out from that one change that's made. And so I view this as a book that's very lightly science fictional, in that I'm not reshaping the whole world, but I'm just putting one little chaotic element into it and following it around.
I'm thinking of like Kurt Vonnegut dropping the Ice Nine, which I think we talked about last time we talked, but like that one little magic bit of Ice Nine that changes the whole world.
Yeah. And I think that I am hoping to do some hard science fiction in the future, but I also think it's really interesting when stories carve a line between different genres, when they borrow a little bit from one genre and then another, because these sorts of choices keep us from falling into the mode of any one genre or the other. And you have to keep reading and sorting out, like, well, this is a realistic element. This is an unusual element that could still be part of our world. And this is a thing we definitely don't have. But I think depending on where you draw the boundaries in the world that we live in today, you can think that this world seems very speculative, and that we live differently, both more differently and more similarly to people in the past than they might have imagined.
I mean, there are two kind of questions I want to ask, but I'll kind of go in because you've given me so much to think about already. But first of all, I'm thinking of California. There's the tradition of the Hollywood novel, and then I think the growing tradition of like the what the heck's going on in California novel. And in your book, there are fires all the time. And indeed, if you drive around California, you just see fire. You're like, there's the huge fire. There's the huge thing over there. Your book does this incredible thing, which is that it zooms, the camera of the book suddenly zooms all the way into like a single animal suffering as the result of these huge things. And I felt you trying to personalize or show the suffering of this thing we might be taking for granted. So were you kind of conscious of like animals and of the pain? I know you were, because there's a plot in the book about kind of the pain of lost things and the pain of lost animals. So the kind of alternate world being here already is something that I felt like you were playing with.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of a larger question, like when is climate change going to arrive? I think up to a year ago or 2 years ago in America, it would still be possible to say like, oh, it's going to arrive in 2035, it's going to arrive in 2050. But depending on where you put your camera, if it's on an island nation that's contending with massive erosion and sea level rise, climate change already arrived years ago. Where you are geographically matters, who you look at matters. And I think that it's a limitation of a lot of how we think about literature and stories, that we are so wedded to a human viewpoint, or often a singular human viewpoint, because the potential that's there in the mechanism of narration is like, in some ways, it it's vastly inhuman, it's alien, it's the ability to pop into whatever perspective you want and travel in a way that no body can across a landscape. So, I think I was thinking a little bit about the difference between a lot of character-focused cinema and something like uh, Norwegian slow TV or something, which follows like a boat making its way through a sea landscape for hours and hours. Like it's a time scale that's utterly real, and we experience this time scale all the time in our lives, but we rarely consume it in terms of narrative or in terms of media. So giving the narrative a chance to go off on some of those tangents, to wander a little bit and see what it finds. I think that one of the things that defines sort of how I think of threat and danger in this story is that there are plenty of clues, but they're not necessarily where the characters are looking. So by artificially like delimiting the space that we look at and the space that we pay attention to, we're actually missing a lot of important things, I think, about the geographical and ecological changes that are happening around us right now.
And that's like that horror movie logic of like, no, like I know there's something there. Why can't you see it?
Yes. And that is always one of my favorite things about a horror movie that lets the camera just creep up towards something and finally makes you aware of the kind of alien and inhuman gaze that is this technology of the camera we've built. It can see things that we wouldn't notice. It can go places we wouldn't go. And, even when humans are gone, cameras could roam the earth and make a movie that no one watches.
That's a new novel idea. I like that one. So when you were talking about horror just now and kind of linking back to your genre point, there's this hilarious moment in the book. So the other lead, Patrick, is there because his novel Elsinore Lane is being adapted. And someone is like, they're turning it into a ghost story. It's about partially a ghost. And he goes, it's not a ghost story, or if it is, it's a ghost story like Hamlet. So Hamlet is, of course, a genre play. If we're using these kind of definitions of like, if there's a ghost, it has to be something that's genre-y.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think Hamlet always remains one of my favorite works to consume. Like I'll always see a Hamlet when it's performed, because it has everything. In some ways, it's an action movie. It's a ghost story. It's a love story that goes wrong. It's a great comedy, chock full of jokes,
Yes.
And I think that in another sense, Hamlet raises some very interesting questions about the relationship of our sphere of knowledge to our sphere of action. Like, where do those two things intersect? Hamlet has an intuition about his uncle's role in the death of his father before he has any evidence whatsoever to back it up. When he finds that evidence, it still sort of fails to turn the story completely on its head. And it still doesn't give him something like the direction or the focus that he needs to act out specifically against his uncle eventually. The people who get killed and the people who suffer aren't at all the target of Hamlet's revenge.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the question of how to translate what we know or what we feel into something that's an adequate response that shapes the world in the way we want it to be shaped is like the eternal question. And one that seems more and more important now as we think about, the IPCC report and what's going to be called for from us as individuals and as a society in the next few years coming up.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think those of us in the audience who love Hamlet, and I am someone who loves Hamlet, it does have that idea that it could be set anywhere and it would be relevant. I'm wondering if maybe this is more of a technical writing question. You have your Rosencrantz and Guildenstern analogs and an epigraph. You have I kept on thinking of Ophelia sinking in the water in madness with the what are and the madness, and I, my lord, I'm too much of the sun. And I'm wondering, when you have a source material or an inspiration that's close to your book, how do you write in relationship to it, or do you put it away, or do you think about it? I just think I know it's a technical question, but it was one I was so fascinated by in reading this.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Because I think that although I admire lots of books that explicitly allude to other books, I feel like I've always been a little bit leery of doing that myself. Also, in my first novel, which had a lot of eating weird snack cakes and a lot of in-depth descriptions of oranges, I didn't know what it was in conversation with. Maybe it was off to the corner talking to itself. I guess it really is. But with this book, I really wanted to refract some of the questions that run through Hamlet and then are doubled down on by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. Like, it feels sometimes like there's been this long discussion or argument or cocktail party conversation about knowledge and action. And this is another thing that's going to put its hands into that pot and try to move things around. One thing that I really wanted to make use of is in Hamlet, so much of the fate that characters end up meeting has to do with how they're seen, how they're perceived, because Hamlet can't perceive Ophelia accurately. It seems like she's doomed to the narrative fate of someone who's done these bad things that he accuses her of. Maybe analogously, if Cassie is my Ophelia in this story, she's always working closely with Patrick, especially when the meat of the detective story sort of kicks into gear. Yeah. But I don't think that she's ever accurately perceived by Patrick, and I'm not sure that she ever accurately perceives him. The things that she connects to that makes her feel like she knows him have to do with like these fragments of story he tells her and emotions he shows her about loving his family. But she builds a person out of those bits. And he also, while seeming to her like someone who doesn't just see her as an overgrown version of her teen detective character that she got famous for playing, we can see that in his private time, he's always watching those episodes and he's always exclusively linking her to them. Like, these are two people who have trouble accessing the person that they're with when they're with them. But maybe that's the way we all are to some extent, or maybe it's something that we can actually actively work on seeing past. So.
And it's kind of the gift of the multi-perspective novel, right? That you can jump from one. I mean, Patrick's inner life is so present in his scenes that I think it's easy to forget what everyone else would see, which is a writer coming in for an adaptation of his book who talks about his wife and kid a lot. And yet we know he is one of the more delightfully funny, ridiculous characters, but a lot of it is in his head.
Yes, yeah. I mean, a lot of what we see in the world is in our heads, I think. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of acculturation that we go through at an age maybe even prior to memory about success, goal-oriented behavior, what types of people you'd like to model yourself on, and what types of feedback from the world constitutes success in some way. And I think that those are really difficult to separate yourself from, especially since our identities in this country, in this economic system, are so geared toward an idea of self-realization in like a public sphere that's also an economic sphere, that's also a sphere of love, respect, and and other things from people around you. So what are you without those things? is an interesting question that I often like to make characters edge toward, as different things that they thought they wanted or thought they could do are stripped away from them. I feel like every book I have, characters go through a sort of subtractive process, and I'm waiting for my own subtractive process too.
And there is there's no more subtractive process for a writer than having a potential film adaptation made of their work, I think. And few are more horrifying than the one that he's going through. I think one thing I loved about this book is I sort of want to ask about writing about a writer as a writer. He has 2 books that you don't show us besides description. Elsinore Lane we mentioned. And then you have this fabulous invention of a book called Hard Crossing, which sounds like a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. And Hard Crossing is, I'm trying to get it right, 50 different perspectives on George Washington crossing the Delaware, right? So he is delightful. And I'm sort of wondering about his existence for you as a character. I think it's natural to ask you about Cassidy, but as a character you're projecting onto a writer. He has this multi-perspective book. He's in a multi-perspective book. He's written a ghost book. Your last book has sort of cultish elements. So I'm wondering about you and him and your relationship with him and his, I mean, this guy goes to California to be a hero and he gets demoted to PA in the first 14 pages of the novel.
Yeah. I mean, I feel I'm the sort of writer who works by chipping things off herself and then trying to build around them. And so there's probably a few components to Patrick's personality that are deeply me. One of them is that I do think I have a sort of infatigable and naive enthusiasm about Hollywood. Like I think that it seems like a place in the world where your fate could be upended in good and bad ways. Like, and maybe that's a dangerous sort of place, but it's also a place that you sort of want to stick yourself into just to see what you're really made of, you know?
Yeah.
But I also, I had the experience once, for example, of having a former editor, the editor of my first novel, his brother was making a movie based on their life, and they wanted to use actual people from both of their lives to fill out the scenes and things like that. So I was in a full day of shoots as an author like myself, or maybe it was myself, I didn't even ask, reading from a book and then sitting around and sometimes pretending to drink a drink and sometimes actually drinking a drink. So I was right in the blur of the fictional and the real material. And the thing that surprised me most was that it was just so mundane in a lot of ways. Like there was so much time where people were sitting around and waiting, where they were just really trying to root themselves for 15 minutes while someone else did a task that needed to be done before they could move on. And the sort of lightly tragic, mostly comedic feeling of thinking you're going to be there in the space where movies are made and find out that it's a space like other spaces with maybe a bigger snack bar and many more people standing around the periphery. It is an interesting one. So I'm always interested in, for example, the images and narratives we prefer to dwell in, like that we find it easier to inhabit this bodiless space of being just an eye watching the film and being absorbed in it than it is to actually be a body standing in the space where that image is generated. Like some of the part of the time and the detritus and the physical material apparatus that's needed to create this very short bit of moving image that seems natural and effortless. It's like the clumsiness of the actual world compared to the dream that we prefer to. root ourselves in.
And that leads me, I think, so naturally to another kind of artifice you create in this book, which is online message rooms. And I'm just going to hold up for the audience that among the many perspectives Alex is working with, we have a literal message room argument and discussion about Cassidy Kane, Kid Detective. And so I wanted to ask, I mean, it's sort of like a high and low about the creation and the impact of message rooms on this book and these online spaces as well. I always think when I talk to my students, you know, they've written and read more than I have today, but it's been in these sort of ephemeral online spaces.
Yeah. I think there might be a question about that in the Q&A too.
Oh, I'll check that out right now.
No, and I love that you pointed to that, because I don't know if you're the same as me, Adam, but I sort of grew up in the age of the old internet, where the internet was more or less with HTML and some JavaScript, and it didn't look so great, but you could slap anything up there, you know. And it was a place where you felt like you had this intimacy and this contact with people just through being interested in the same thing, even if you would, you know, never come into contact with them in your regular life. And I thought that was kind of magical. And in this day, like it feels a little bit less magical. Like it seems like there's a clearer message board to reality pipeline than there ever was before. And yet it remains just as easy to spin stories and create these webworks of narrative from disparate and unrelated pieces of information. So people are still telling stories in these spaces, but the stories tend to creep out of those spaces more and affect the world, or affect how you see the world more. And I think that while I was writing this book, I was really interested in fan culture, which is a little bit different from QAnon culture.
Yeah, which is Adam Bernstein's excellent question in the chat is about QAnon. Yeah,
but which still has a relationship to the cultures, I think, because it's like communities grow up around whatever focal point that they're interested in, and they grow, and then they often start to fracture in similar ways, I think, as maybe it shows us something about like community growth, fractal breaking, like factionalization. I don't know what it is, but I find it fascinating. And one of my favorite things about this message board that Patrick starts creeping onto, where they discuss in in-depth detail old episodes of Cassidy Kane, Teen Detective, and what they might be trying to tell us in terms of the larger unexplained mystery of that show. Like what would have happened in the next season if it hadn't been canceled too early. It is that you have these groups of people who are arguing so vehemently about their interpretation of this fictional TV show. Some believe that the show is hinting at a reveal, and a resolution that would have happened in the final season. But other people believe that it's actually hinting at a real crime that happened somewhere in California, probably. It could be someplace else, but probably California. Maybe an oil spill, maybe a toxic dump, maybe some other kind of massacre or catastrophe. And we can actually find the clues that point to a real place and a real group of people who are involved in that. And yet all of this interpretation is being expended on an object that you could say maybe doesn't deserve it, or you could say that there is a real sort of misdeed happening in the world of this novel that people are not expending as much hermeneutic power on, you know? So we know so much. We're better interpreters and analysts and more complicated readers, I think, overall than maybe our culture has been in the past. But it still feels sometimes like we're looking in the wrong place, and that there are other places where, you know, our attention could be focused more. And yet, like, I think all of these commenters on the message board are tapping into this feeling that it's very real, that like something's wrong. What I see around me that looks stable and looks home-like and familiar isn't actually home-like and familiar. There's something else but that we want to excavate. And I think we share that across a large swath of the population right now.
I think you're so right. And there's something really like kind of gratifying about it being in a novel where I do know I should pay attention to it, right? I know there's going to be clues. So you're kind of pulling these things up and out, just like the form, the shell does confer some sort of legitimacy to all these different things you're playing with. And that brings us to a great question. I'm going in the chronological order we're receiving them. A novel like this, says anonymous attendee, with so many perspectives and big ideas, must be a challenge to write. How do you think about structure while you're writing? Do the ideas and plot dictate the structure? Are you mapping this all out ahead of time? Red strings tacked to a corkboard?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should get a corkboard, but we don't have the wall space. I think like naturally I tend to want to be a minimalist, but I also tend to want to disturb that impulse of myself, because there's something about being uncomfortable and doing something for the first time, or doing something that you feel you can't do possibly, that is invigorating. And so in this book, I really wanted to cast a wider net than I had before, and bring in more than I knew I could handle. And because of that, I had to be really rigorous with myself in a way that I'm not used to being. I don't usually outline, but for this book, I decided arbitrarily from the start that there were going to be 10 chapters. I decided each chapter would have 3 segments within it. One important thing would happen in each segment, and each segment would be 9 pages long. So way more overdetermined than it needed to be to get written. But it was a way of making a sort of clock for myself that I had to hold myself to, that I was certain everything that I was doing would culminate in or intersect in or run into a plot point, so that I could cover the distance I needed to arrive at the ending. So I do have some crazy looking outlines for this book. And at the same time, this was the first book, I think, where I was able to clean up a lot and make these lines clearer in revision without hopefully too clear too. So it's tough to aim for something that feels out of control but is also within control, and will give the impression of being out of control without actually being a nightmare to wade through. In my next book, what I'm going to aim for is balance, perfect balance.
Perfect
which also
balance.
sounds perfect balance. I'm going to write that on the post-it and put it above my desk. Maybe that'll help.
I like that we've gone from corkboard to post-it in your wall space model in your tiny room.
Yeah.
Well, I think before I go to the next question, something you said that I want to follow up on that great question. This is also a detective novel. And I think of detective novels, maybe as being quite plotted, but also I feel when I'm reading a good detective story, like the writer is just throwing elements in to use later, to kind of surprise themselves, to have fun, so I was wondering when I assume you knew this was going to pivot to a buddy detective story in the second act. And I'm wondering, are you just throwing stuff in knowing you're going to come back to it? Because it really has that air of a great detective story, which is, I really want to find out what's going on.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind, Adam. Something I think that's magical that you can do in a book is you can imbue any detail with this sense of weight and make it so that the reader wants to take it and pick it up and keep it, carry along with them. And when that happens out of genre, when it has nothing to do with clues or larger mystery or storyline, I love it too. And I think that a lot of it is about playing with attention and focus, and pushing things to the foreground that don't look like they have to be there, and therefore seem like there's a special significance for them being there. So I think that there might be the possibility of building in these clues and placing them strategically in there so that they're found later, all from the start. But I often wrote myself into the part of the plot I wanted to be in, and then I worked backwards to think, how can I build a trail back to that? So what's wonderful about a book is you read it front to back and it feels like it has a natural flow in that direction, but you get to fold so much more time into that thing that's experienced linearly. Um, there's like no other medium that I feel is like that. And so, yeah, you get to work forwards and backwards and layer things, take things out, destroy your scaffolding, and in the end it just reads start to end like a film. And working on a film isn't that way. You have to actually have everything in line when you start, which is something I could never do, and that's why I'm a writer.
I'm with you there. And we actually have two film questions in the chat, so you've given us a segue to them. Film question one, speaking of adaptations in Hollywood, any plans to adapt this book for the screen? Do you think a film would work?
I think these things are being decided, and like there are questions. I got a question recently, like, would I consider gender flipping the main character? And I think that falls into the realm of what could be flexed and moved and made plastic in the story, and there are other things that absolutely cannot. For example, the desert. The desert is the whole point of it for me. It's the part where I still feel a piece of my mind is. I think a film of this could work. I think it could work better than my first book, which I did adapt. And I think that, I think it would be a lot of fun for someone to figure out like what water would look like and how you would make it behave just a little bit different from the water that we know and have so much familiarity with.
Yeah, I can answer it too. I think it would be a great film. I really do. I think there's something really in the act structure and playing with Hollywood. I kept thinking of Elliot Gould's The Long Goodbye, which is like a California movie and yet also a genre movie.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, California movies are my favorite movies. The movies that explicitly take place in California and are not merely California playing something else, some other place. And I always feel like a sense of relief when watching one of those films, even if nothing relieving is going on in the storyline, Yeah.
And second film question in the chat. I love that. It's a good joke too. Not to harp on the film analogies, but is there anything that ended up on the cutting room floor that you could tell us about?
That's a really good question. One of the things that ended up on the cutting room floor that I was interested in was was playing up one of the symptoms of water poisoning, which is that in addition to memory loss and hallucinating a man in a suit and things like that, you also experience a lot of unrequited love, which I think is an interesting human phenomenon that also relates to being at some level of distance from reality, like living a little bit more in the fantasy zone than in the reality zone. Originally, I had more scenes where Patrick was experiencing on his end the growing sort of romantic relationship between him and Cassidy. But in the end, I sort of felt like to keep them both in the picture, I would just invest more in the actual relationship that was being built between them, which was a lot more familial and a lot clumsier, sort of, and all that. Yeah. There was something that began to feel pretty tender to me about the way that she cared for him when she wasn't caring for others, and he sort of supported and ballasted her when he also isn't really that person for a lot of people.
It ends up being a very tender relationship. And actually, you're answering anonymous attendees' question. I'd love to hear more about the ideas you came up with for synthetic water. And you've partially answered that. And they also hope you write more science fiction in the future. So maybe they want to know more about water. Like, can you talk to, I know we only have about 5 minutes, but can you talk a little more about creating water? Water?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Water without the hyphen is the substance that we have such a long relationship to in our bodies and in our evolution. And you could define what things water does to us and extract those sorts of principles, but it wouldn't capture the full depth of the way we are in fit and flesh with this particular substance. And so when you think of a water that's almost exactly the same, that can perform all the same functions, but it boils at a little bit too high a temperature, or it freezes a little bit early. I was thinking of a molecule that's just a little bit larger than usual, like water with an increased polarity that causes it to clump with other molecules to a greater degree than it already does, because that is also one of water's features that makes it so great. And what I really wish I had gotten to spend more time on is I had a whole vision of how like the landscape would look when it had been sort of saturated by water for a number of months or a year. Like that you'd have plants that looked a little bit more plastic. You'd have plants that had sort of clogs in them, like if you know, I'm forgetting the term for it right now, but like sometimes they form like a bulb or something. It's usually a parasitic thing. But what if just drawing water up the stalk of a plant was no longer a thing that could be done smoothly? So you'd have these strange misshapen stalks, wider stalks, all the different ways in which the natural environment would react to this slightly different thing. Because I think I covered, for example, that you could get water in a stickier version or a slipperier version, and you might like wash with a slipperier version, but you might drink the stickier version to stay more hydrated if you're a high performer or something.
Sport water that coats the tongue.
Yes, coats the tongue. You kind of drink it and you want to towel off your mouth or something because it doesn't feel quite right. Oh, thank you, Ben.
Ben says for the chat that water glass with the ice cube sinking to the bottom is utterly horrifying, and it is.
Thank you, Ben. And literally, whenever you run into me, whenever you see me, when things are more in person and go back to normal, I'd love to just geek out about water and the different ways in which I think it would be.
That's a plan.
I think we're close to the end and we're going to turn it back to Community Bookstore, but I just want to say like a huge thank you to you, Adam. It's so wonderful to talk to you. I'm such a fan of your criticism and I'm so eager for your novel in progress. Like I'm going to be first in line to beg proofs or galleys or manuscript or whatever is available when. And thank you to Community Bookstore. When I was back briefly on the East Coast, I went in there. It's such a palace of books. It's so calming, like a wood-lined cave of everything you could want and some things I did not know I wanted, which is the magical thing about a great bookstore. I loved my visit and I loved being back there. It's like being back home.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Alex.
much.
It's always a pleasure to have you in the store and here on Zoom, of course. Not quite the same, but Alex, Adam, thank you both so much. Such a thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation. I really enjoyed it. Those of you at home, please consider purchasing a copy of Something New Under the Sun from Community Bookstore, and we hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. Thank you for joining us and have a really wonderful evening, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Bye.